A 7¼ inch gauge Sweet William steam locomotive, part 30. Fitting the twin water gauges to the boiler backhead was not as simple as I thought it was going to be. It is important to make sure that they are perfectly aligned. Before I start fitting the water gauges, I thought I would show you these. If you've been following the series, the last time you saw these, they were painted green. And the paintwork was very bad, so I took them down to a place just at the bottom of the village, and they spent some time in a paint removal bath. If you look underneath the cladding, you can see traces of rust that must have been eating its way under the original paint. What I'll be doing very shortly is rubbing down these pieces of steel with an orbital sander and repainting them. I need to do this outside the workshop, and I need to wait until the weather improves slightly. In the meantime, there are plenty of other jobs to do. Today I'm going to fit the twin water gauges to the boiler backhead. These are really nicely made units, but I've found a bit of a problem, not with the water gauges, but with the thickness of the weld around the edge of the firebox. I don't think it's going to be a problem if I use a thick washer underneath the lock nut, but without the washer, the welding around the edge gets in the way of the lock nut. I think it'll be okay when I fit the washer. You can clearly see in this image how close the welding around the firebox is to the two top holes. Before fitting these water gauge parts to the boiler, I need to set the orientation of the blowdown valves so that both of the levers face inwards. That way you can operate them with the shovel. Before I start the job, I'm going to give the holes in the boiler a good clean. I'm using a paintbrush for this because there's quite a bit of debris in there. In this close-up, you can see now that there isn't much debris because the paintbrush has removed most of it. I didn't want to risk anything blocking the way through the water gauge. Here's a magnified image and you can see the welding problem on the top fitting. If I fit the water gauge like this, then the nut is going to foul the welding, and that's no good at all. In my box of assorted shim washers at this size, I found 4 that are perfect for the job. They're all quite thick. In this episode you will see me using this special spanner. It's a Barco adjustable spanner, but the jaws are half thickness, ideal for tightening lock nuts. On this job I'm not using Loctite 542 because I've temporarily run out of it. I'm using some stuff called Bond Lock, which is basically the same stuff. It's a hydraulic sealant. If, when I pressurise the boiler, the joints leak, I will eat my words and go back to Loctite 542. It's really important to make sure that these parts align. Here I'm adjusting the lock nut to tighten the lower fitting in the correct position. Here I'm applying some Bond Lock to the top fitting, after which I screw this component into the backhead also. Sometimes you can be lucky and the parts line up perfectly, but these didn't and needed a bit of adjustment. I'm going to preempt anyone writing in saying I wouldn't use the glass to line up a water gauge, I would use a piece of bar. Well, I disagree with that. Yes, a piece of bar at the same thickness of the glass would be fine, but you may not get it quite as accurate as you think. Using a piece of glass like this seems to be a good way to do the job. It doesn't take any prisoners. If you get it wrong, the glass breaks. I have a special glass tube cutter that I bought on eBay a few years ago, and it's really useful. It just scores the glass, then all you have to do is just snap off the bit that you want, like this. It's probably a good idea to use a piece of cloth, but I like to live dangerously. But not that dangerously. I'm cleaning up the end of the glass tube on a piece of wet or dry sandpaper. Yes, you can use a blowtorch and make it nice and round, but this method seems to work perfectly well, and in no time at all, the gauge glass is sat in the gauge and it's perfectly aligned. No sooner had I fitted the glass tube than I removed it to use as a template to cut the second piece. I need to break off this very short piece, and for this I am using a piece of cloth, but it's still snapped off really clean. As before, I then rub the end of the glass tube on some wet or dry sandpaper. In the main water gauge bag, I found these 4 O-rings, so I assumed that I fitted 1 O-ring to each end of the water gauge, which is the normal way of doing things. But in this case, when I tightened the nut, it was hard up against the main fitting and it wasn't putting enough pressure on the O-ring. I'm not too worried about this situation for the moment. because I will have to remove the glass again to fit the gauge protector. Temporarily I fitted the top cap in place. Shortly after I'd done this job, I looked in the bag that contained the water gauges when I bought them and found another 4 O-rings. Mystery solved. There are 8 in total, so each of the water gauges uses 2 O-rings. Once I fitted 2 of these at each end of the glass tube and replaced the nuts, everything was fine. There was plenty of tolerance to allow me to tighten the nuts, but do bear in mind you never need to tighten these nuts much. You need to allow for contraction and expansion of the boiler and indeed the fittings. If you over-tighten them, you will crack the glass. I had a couple of O-rings in my box of O-rings that were quite small and very thin, and these were ideal to fit to each of the top caps. Better than thread sealant because it makes them easy to remove should I ever need to do that. That's one side done, and I must say that I think these water gauges are really good quality. Now it's time to fit the one at the other side. And once again in this clip you can really see how close the hole is to the weld on the firebox. But it did work out okay. It fitted perfectly with the washer in place, just to hold the nut away from the weld. As you can see, I've just removed the top cap, ready to put a piece of glass in here. The gauge at this side wasn't as easy as at the other side. I found it really difficult to get it to perfectly line up. And at one stage I cracked the glass, which confirmed that the water gauge fittings were not in alignment. They need to be aligned left and right and front to back. After a bit of fiddling about and a bit of adjusting, I got there in the end. I cut a new piece of glass, fitted the 2 O-rings to it, and then fitted the first of the nuts. And now this side feels almost identical to the other side. The glass slides in and out smoothly without jamming anywhere. With another very small O-ring fitted in the groove on the top cap, I screwed it in place. At this stage I thought it would be a really good idea to check that the regulator block doesn't get in the way of the water gauges. And it doesn't, it's perfectly fine. And that is it, the water gauges are fitted in place. The next job will be to make the water gauge protectors. But that's it for this episode. Stay safe, stay healthy, thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.